Good.
Fine, thanks, right? Fine, thanks. Didn't you say that?
Yeah.
Oh, let me hold that door for you. Oh, thanks. No snow today. Yeah, thank God. Because they were getting snow up north today, weren't they? Well, thanks. That's a word that's just a pleasantry, isn't it? It's good manners to say thanks. My mom always said that. Please and thank you. Remember those things. And we don't often mean anything particular by it. It's kind of a reaction, right? We just say it. It may be just a little acknowledgement that someone did something to help you, like they held the door at the post office when you were coming in with all those packages. Or it may be a quasi-prayer, not very reverent, just a kind of hollow phrase that happens to include the words thanks and God in it. You know, like it's thank God. You know. But you know, sometimes we are a little more intentional about our thanks. Like the man who was coming home late from dinner because he'd had a rough day at the office. And so he comes flying into the house, his family's sitting around the dinner table waiting for him. He hurries to his chair, he sits down at the table, and he offers up a quick prayer of thanks for the food. And as soon as he's finished praying, he begins to complain and grumble about how awful things were at work, his boss is a jerk, his coworkers are lazy. Then his wife, long-suffering wife, she gets up and she starts serving out the food. And of course he was so late that the food that was supposed to be hot was cold, and the food that was cold was warm. And the main dish was overcooked, and it was dried out, and the bread was hard. I mean, the guy was having a bad day, you know? But he also made sure that he pointed out everything that was wrong on the table. Now, after hearing all these complaints, his youngest daughter says, "Daddy, do you think God heard you when you prayed a few minutes ago?" "Well, yes, sweetheart. Of course he did." Then she asked, "Do you think he heard everything you said after that?" "Why, yes, sweetheart. God hears everything." Finally, she says, "Daddy, which one do you think he believed?"
Oh, that's awesome.
Out of the mouths of babes, huh? Well, thanks is something that we often say, but we don't mean it. And yet we have a holiday that is dedicated to giving thanks, right? Most of us are going to get the day off Thursday, right? I mean, I know some of our first responders and nurses and doctors, they don't get the day off, but everybody's going to get that day off from work. And many of us are going to get together with family and friends, and we're going to eat turkey and pie and watch football and basically laze around the house, right? That's what women don't get to do that. We were out in the kitchen, but, you know, I grew up in a house full of men. That's what they did. So even the day that has been set aside for Thanksgiving has become as spiritually hollow as the dinner prayer that this dad who was late from getting home from work said at his table. So, you know, I don't think we can depend upon the world around us for the wisdom on what real thanks is all about. But, you know, we can turn to someone who loves us enough to show us what real thanks is. And so this morning, I just want to take just a few brief snapshots of Jesus, showing us what real thanks is all about. The first thing is that real thanks is depending on God, knowing that God's going to provide. That's number one. In John 6, we read, Jesus took the loaves and he gave thanks and he distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fishes. You remember the story, right? Jesus took these 5 little barley loaves, little tiny loaves of bread, and 2 small fish that a little boy had brought his lunch that day. And he miraculously fed over 5,000 men, okay? The feeding of the 5,000 was men. Now you know that there was at least 4 times that many because there were women and children. So, you know, you get 25,000 people that he's feeding. And we see something very remarkable here. Because the very first thing he does is he thanks God in advance that God's going to provide. He depended on God knowing that God was not going to let him down, that God's going to give them what they needed. And so real thanks is depending on God, knowing that he will provide. Whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, Jesus said. Second, real thanks presupposes that God's always listening. Like the man at the table. Yes, Daddy, God's listening, isn't he? God's always listening. But he's not just listening. He's waiting for us to ask him so he can act on our behalf. So we have the beautiful picture in John 11. So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked up and he said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. So here's Jesus. He's standing outside the tomb of Lazarus, one of his best friends. Lazarus had died. He was dead for 4 days. He was in a grave. And he stands outside the grave and he thanks God in front of this crowd of people that he's there with him and he's listening. And this moment right after he gives this prayer of thanks, Jesus calls Lazarus to come out of the tomb. And Lazarus walks out of the tomb resurrected from death after 4 days. And Jesus, of course, is seeing what he was going to suffer in a few days when he would die on the cross. And yet he still could stand there and thank God and trust God that he was going to act on his behalf. So real thanks presupposes that God's always listening and he's waiting to act on your behalf. And you know, when others see you believing this, just like the crowd that day with Jesus, they're going to come to believe in the Lord. The third thing is that real thanks is trusting in God's plan for our lives and living according to it. You know, nothing is random in your life. God has a plan and a purpose for you. We're reading Ephesians with the Bible study. That plan and purpose God had in place for you before the beginning of the world. Just put your life in that perspective. So here's Jesus. This is the Last Supper. This is Matthew and Luke's Gospels give us this account. It says, while they were eating, Jesus took bread, and he gave thanks, and he broke it, and then he gave it to the disciples, saying, take and eat, this is my body broken for you. So think about this. Even on the night before this horrible death that he was going to suffer, Jesus thanked God for what was going to come. His beating, his trial, his execution. But God's plan for Jesus went so far beyond the human suffering that he would endure. Because on the cross, you see, God had a plan and a purpose for Jesus from the beginning of the world. And Jesus was going to complete that plan that God had made by removing the barrier of sin between God and us, so that we could once more be in a loving relationship with God and each other. So we can walk face to face with God now. So Jesus shows us what real thanks is by trusting in God's plan for our lives. God bless you. To trust God's plan for our lives and to live according to it. So when we look at the example of Jesus, we see that real thanks is not just paying lip service to God for some past blessing. Real thanks is not reactive. It's not just looking over your shoulder and saying, phew, made it through that, thank you God for helping me. It's proactive. It's believing that God knows your needs even before you do, and that you can depend upon him to provide what you need in better ways that you could ever imagine or ask for. So real thanks, the kind of thanks that is acceptable to God, will reflect everything that Jesus showed us. So think about these things this week. Real thanks is depending on God, knowing that he will provide. Real thanks is presupposing that God always is listening, and he's waiting there to act on your behalf. God's just waiting for you to turn to him and reach out to him. And real thanks is trusting that God has a plan for your life and living into it and according to it. On Colossians, the Apostle Paul gives us these words, whatever you do, whether it's in word or deed, do it all in the name of Jesus Christ, giving thanks to God the Father through him. So real thanks is living in an attitude of gratitude. I know you've heard that little saying before, but that's what it is. Living your life in an attitude of gratitude. When I was 16 years old, I went to get my test for my learner's permit to drive. Remember that? You had driver ed in school, and you had to get your little driver's certificate. But you know, I didn't get it because I failed the vision test. You know, I wasn't too disappointed though, because that meant I could go and get prescription glasses. Oh, I was psyched about this. And I almost thought I would bring them today because I still have them and I forgot to bring them. But I wanted to get those glasses like John Lennon had. You remember those little, silver, round, wire-rimmed glasses? Because those were really cool, you know. So I did. I got a pair of those glasses. You know, I don't know why my father ever let me do it, but he did. But it wasn't just the glasses. I had to have tinted lenses. Now, you could get any color lenses you wanted. So I wanted them tinted a really nice shade of pale yellow. Bad idea. But, you know, it was so cool because when I looked through the lenses, my focus was adjusted, and the world always had this warm, luminous glow. This is probably looking like, if you had jaundice, that's probably what it was like. But you know, I was 16, what did I know? I was cool. I had yellow glasses and nobody in my class had them except for me, you know. I wasn't worried about being picked on, I'll tell you. I didn't care. But living with an attitude of gratitude, something like those glasses. Because real thanks means that you look at the world through a different set of lenses. You look with an attitude of gratitude, with thankfulness in your heart. It's not looking at a glass as half empty or half full. It's knowing the glass is always full because God's always filling it. It's never not full. Henry Nouwen was a Dutch Catholic priest and a mystic and a writer in the 20th century. I don't know, have you ever read anything by Henry Nouwen? I know Debbie did because you know, she talked about the Prodigal Son book. He was a very insightful Christian man. And he wrote this. Now, I love this because I read this every Thanksgiving. He said, to be grateful for the good things that happen in our lives is easy, isn't it? But to be grateful for all of our lives, the good as well as the bad, the moments of joy as well as the moments of sorrow, the successes as well as the failures, the rewards as well as the rejections. That requires hard spiritual work. But still, we're only truly grateful people when we can say thank you to all that has brought us to this present moment. As long as we keep dividing our lives between events and people we would like to remember and those whom we would rather forget, we cannot claim the fullness of our beings as a gift from God to be grateful for. So let's not be afraid to look at everything that's brought us to where we are now and trust that we will soon see in it the guiding hand of a loving God. Will you pray with me the prayer that you found on your bulletin? I think you have it on your insert. Let us pray. Lord, help us to live as you did, with an attitude of gratitude, depending on God, knowing that God will provide for all our needs, presupposing that God is always listening and waiting to act on our behalf, and trusting in God's plan for our lives and living according to it. This is our prayer for Thanksgiving Sunday and every day. Amen. Amen and amen.